As summer turned to autumn in 1940, American intelligence officers confronted a terrifying reality. They were deaf to Japan's intentions. For a year and a half, the nation's brightest cryptographic minds had thrown themselves against an encryption system that seemed mathematically invincible. Tokyo's diplomats were transmitting their most sensitive communications through a cipher machine whose complexity bordered on the impossible. Washington's experts had analysed thousands of intercepted messages. Every attempt ended the same way, in complete failure. The Americans called this system Purple. The device generating it was Japan's Type B cipher machine, a mechanical marvel so advanced that its creators in Tokyo considered it beyond the reach of any codebreaker on Earth. Through Purple, Japanese officials coordinated strategy with Berlin, exchanged intelligence with Rome, and discussed their secret plans even while maintaining diplomatic relations in Washington. The cipher had become an impenetrable wall around Japan's most critical secrets. Then, on a sweltering September afternoon, something extraordinary happened. A young woman sat hunched over her desk in a cramped Washington office, studying the same meaningless letter sequences that had stumped every analyst before her. She'd been calculating railroad retirement benefits just 12 months earlier. Now she stared at worksheets covered in what looked like complete randomness. At 2 p.m. on September 20th, her eyes caught something the others had missed, a subtle pattern woven into the apparent chaos. Within 1 week, the United States would be reading Tokyo's most protected diplomatic communications. Her name was Genevieve Grotjan, a 27-year-old mathematician who couldn't land a high school teaching position. She was about to achieve what the Encyclopedia of American Women at War would eventually recognize as among the most significant cryptanalytic accomplishments in American history. This is the account of someone whose exceptional abilities were repeatedly rejected by the education system, yet who ultimately helped preserve thousands of American lives. It's the story of intellectual persistence, extraordinary insight, and the unsung heroism of a person who altered history's trajectory from inside a government building. This is how a woman working as a statistical clerk broke through what everyone believed was an unbreakable cipher. During the closing years of the 1930s, civilization was careening toward disaster. Hitler's Germany had swallowed Austria and Czechoslovakia whole, trampling international agreements while democratic nations stood paralyzed. Mussolini was constructing his fascist domain across Africa, dropping bombs on defenseless communities and deploying chemical weapons against Ethiopian troops. Across the Pacific, Japan's imperial forces were prosecuting a merciless campaign throughout China, perpetrating acts of violence that horrified observers worldwide. The League of Nations had crumbled beneath its own powerlessness. Diplomatic efforts collapsed repeatedly as authoritarian regimes grew emboldened by each unchallenged conquest. Every global power recognized that worldwide war was unavoidable. The remaining uncertainties were simply timing, geographic scope, and ultimate victor. For American strategists, Japan presented the most puzzling threat. Military leadership understood a Pacific confrontation was approaching, yet they possessed almost no visibility into Japanese strategic thinking. What did Tokyo ultimately seek to achieve? What instructions were Japanese ambassadors receiving from their capital regarding the Axis alliance? What covert agreements bound Japan to Germany and Italy? Would Japanese forces move northward against Soviet territory, or would they strike southward toward the resource-rich territories controlled by European colonial powers? These questions carried life-or-death implications for millions of American service members. Japan's leadership understood that communication security was fundamental to their strategic advantage. Surprise formed the cornerstone of Japanese military philosophy. If Washington could anticipate Tokyo's moves, that crucial edge would evaporate. In February 1939, Japan's foreign ministry deployed a revolutionary cipher device for its most sensitive diplomatic transmissions. Japanese engineers had studied Germany's Enigma machine, which employed rotating mechanisms to scramble text through intricate electrical pathways. But Japan's designers pushed further. They engineered something considerably more sophisticated. They designated it the Type B cipher machine, or the 97 alphabetical typewriter, named for year 2597 in Japan's imperial calendar. American cryptanalysts would assign it a more straightforward designation. They labelled it Purple, simply because they organised their files on this system in purple-coloured folders To distinguish them from previous Japanese codes they'd identified by other colours, purple represented a masterwork of encryption engineering. Unlike Germany's Enigma with its rotating wheels, called rotors, purple utilised telephone stepping switches, the identical technology powering automated phone exchanges throughout America. This design made the machine extraordinarily complex. Messages typed into purple travelled through successive layers of electrical switching, each layer scrambling letters through different patterns. The potential combinations reached into the billions. Anyone attempting to crack purple through sheer trial and error, testing each possible key configuration, would require more time than the universe has existed. The mechanism functioned by splitting the 26-letter alphabet into two segments. 6 letters, typically vowels, were enciphered through one system. The other 20 letters were processed through a separate, vastly more intricate arrangement of 3 interconnected stepping switches. These two groups were then merged to generate the final encrypted output. This division into what American codebreakers termed the 6s and 20s served as both the system's greatest strength and, ultimately, its fatal vulnerability. Tokyo's foreign ministry considered purple absolutely unbreakable. Their confidence was total. Through purple, the Japanese government transmitted its most critical intelligence to diplomatic posts worldwide. Negotiation directives for Washington, summaries of discussions with Hitler, strategic evaluations of the European conflict. Everything flowed through the purple cipher. Tokyo remained certain nobody could decipher a single word. For 18 excruciating months, that confidence appeared entirely justified. America could intercept Japanese transmissions without difficulty. Radio signals traversed the Pacific, and American monitoring facilities captured thousands of them. But interception and comprehension were completely different challenges. The captured traffic appeared as nothing more than meaningless letter jumbles without the decryption key. Purple had repelled every American attempt to penetrate it. Genevieve Marie Grotjan entered the world on April 30th, 1913 in Buffalo, New York, an industrial city of working families situated along Lake Erie's shores. She was Frederick Grotjan's only child. Frederick worked as a pharmacist, his parents having emigrated from Germany seeking better prospects in America. Her mother maintained their comfortable middle-class household, managing domestic affairs while Frederick developed his pharmacy practice. Nothing about her origins suggested she would emerge as a pivotal figure in American intelligence history. Yet from childhood, Genevieve possessed an exceptional aptitude for mathematics. Numbers spoke to her in ways they didn't communicate to other children. She perceived relationships and patterns that completely escaped her peers. While classmates struggled with algebra, memorizing equations and labouring through procedures they scarcely understood, Genevieve surged forward, discovering elegant solutions to problems that baffled her instructors. Mathematics wasn't labour for her. It was recreation. It was discovery. It was a language revealing concealed truths about reality's underlying structure. By high school, she determined her life's direction. She would become a mathematics educator and share her passion for numbers with future generations. She envisioned herself standing before students, witnessing comprehension dawn in their eyes, knowing she'd helped unlock young minds. Teaching mathematics represented more than a career path for Genevieve. It was a vocation. She enrolled at the University of Buffalo, immersing herself in mathematical studies with intense dedication. She excelled academically, achieving top marks in nearly every course. Her professors acknowledged her remarkable abilities and urged her toward advanced study. She explored not merely mathematical procedures but underlying theory, the profound principles connecting different branches of the discipline. In February 1936, she graduated summa cum laude with a mathematics degree, the university's highest possible distinction. Her professors praised her capabilities in the strongest language. Her prospects appeared brilliant. Surely, with such credentials, securing a teaching position at a high school or perhaps even a small college would be straightforward. She began distributing applications to schools throughout the region, confident her qualifications would speak eloquently. But the Great Depression had devastated America's economy. 25% of workers were jobless. Manufacturing plants sat empty. Thousands of banks had collapsed. Employment was scarce everywhere, and teaching positions were no exception. Schools were shuttering, not hiring. Districts that had previously employed multiple mathematics teachers were consolidating, releasing staff rather than recruiting new personnel. The rare openings that appeared attracted dozens or hundreds of candidates. Despite her extraordinary qualifications, Genevieve Grotjan couldn't find a single institution willing to employ her as a mathematics teacher. She submitted application after application. Rejections accumulated on her desk. Months elapsed without offers. She observed classmates with inferior credentials securing positions through family connections or fortunate timing. But for Genevieve, summa cum laude graduate, the doors stayed firmly closed. The experience left her deeply disappointed. She'd done everything correctly. She'd worked diligently. She'd earned the highest honours. None of it appeared to matter. The world cared nothing for her talent. The world needed fewer mathematics teachers than it produced mathematics graduates. Genevieve was simply unfortunate enough to have graduated at the wrong moment in history. Eventually needing income and exhausted from waiting for an opportunity that might never materialize, she accepted whatever work she could obtain. The Railroad Retirement Board, a federal agency administering pension benefits for retired railroad employees, was hiring statistical clerks. It wasn't her dream career. It bore no connection to teaching, but it was honest employment that utilized her mathematical capabilities. So Genevieve Grotjan, summa cum laude graduate with aspirations of inspiring young minds, went to work calculating monthly pension payments for retired railroad engineers. She performed the job competently, naturally. Mathematics came effortlessly to her, and pension calculations were simply applied mathematics. She worked conscientiously, never complaining publicly about the chasm between her aspirations and her reality. She felt grateful to have employment when countless others had none. She recognized that millions of Americans would have envied her stable government salary, but she never abandoned hope for something more, something that would genuinely challenge her remarkable intellect. Do you think organizations today do enough to identify talented people in unexpected places? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. In 1939, Genevieve took a standard civil service examination, hoping to qualify for a salary increase. The federal government employed standardized testing to evaluate employee capabilities and identify advancement potential. The mathematics section was designed to identify government workers with exceptional quantitative skills. When results arrived, Genevieve's scores were remarkable. They exceeded the average by such a margin that they attracted attention far beyond the Railroad Retirement Board. Her performance indicated someone with genuine mathematical talent, perhaps someone drastically underutilized calculating pension benefits. At that moment, a brilliant and unconventional individual named William Friedman was constructing something unprecedented for the United States Army. Friedman directed the Signal Intelligence Service, a small, highly classified organization devoted to breaking foreign nations' codes and ciphers. He was universally regarded as America's preeminent cryptanalyst of his generation, a pioneer who had developed mathematical techniques for attacking complex cipher systems. Friedman's textbooks on cryptanalysis trained generations of codebreakers. His theoretical insights had transformed the field from artistic intuition into rigorous science. Friedman constantly searched for talented individuals to join his team. He discovered that conventional credentials mattered far less in code breaking than raw intellectual capability. Someone with a mathematics doctorate might lack the intuition needed to spot patterns in ciphertext. Meanwhile, someone who'd never attended graduate school might possess exactly the kind of mind that could perceive what others overlooked. Friedman recruited mathematicians and linguists, musicians and crossword enthusiasts. He sought people who thought differently, who approached problems from unconventional angles. When Friedman encountered Genevieve Grotjan's test scores, he recognized potential. Here was someone with authentic mathematical ability, exactly the kind of mind that might succeed where others had failed. He made inquiries about her background. He learned she was working as a statistical clerk, a position far beneath her demonstrated capabilities. He arranged an interview. The meeting must have felt strange for Genevieve. Friedman couldn't reveal much about the actual work. The Signal Intelligence Service's very existence was classified. He could only speak generally about mathematical analysis and pattern recognition, but whatever he communicated was sufficient. In 1939, he offered Genevieve Grotjan a position as a junior cryptanalyst. Genevieve knew almost nothing about code breaking. She'd never studied cryptanalysis. She had no background in languages or intelligence operations. She'd never even heard of the Signal Intelligence Service before Friedman contacted her. But Friedman wasn't seeking experience. He was seeking raw intellectual capacity. He would provide the training himself. What he needed was someone with the mental agility to spot patterns in apparent randomness, someone with patience to work through impossibly tedious calculations, someone who wouldn't surrender when problems seemed hopeless. Genevieve Grotjan had proven she possessed all these qualities. Her years at the Railroad Retirement Board had tested her patience and persistence. Her mathematical training had sharpened her analytical abilities. Her experience with disappointment had taught her to continue working, even when success seemed improbable. She was precisely what Friedman was seeking. When Genevieve arrived at the Signal Intelligence Service in 1939, she entered a world unlike anything she'd known. The organization operated under strict secrecy from the munitions building in Washington, a temporary structure erected during World War I that had somehow never been demolished. The work was classified at the highest levels. Employees were prohibited from discussing anything about their activities with friends, family, or anyone beyond the office. When asked about their work, they were instructed to say they were clerks who sharpened pencils and emptied wastebaskets. The cover story was deliberately mundane, designed to bore anyone who might ask follow-up questions. In reality, the people behind those desks were engaged in some of the most intellectually demanding work being conducted anywhere on Earth. The team she joined was remarkably small considering its mission's enormity. William Friedman had assembled a handful of brilliant specialists, people who thought differently, who approached problems from unusual angles. Frank Rowlett, a former mathematics teacher from a small Virginia town, led the team attacking Japanese ciphers. He'd been among Friedman's first recruits in 1930, when the Signal Intelligence Service was just beginning. Rowlett possessed a natural gift for cryptanalysis, and the determination to pursue a problem for months or years if necessary. Leo Rosen was an electrical engineering student from MIT, whose understanding of machines would prove essential in coming months. Abraham Sinkoff and Solomon Kolbach were New York City mathematicians who had become expert cryptanalysts under Friedman's guidance. Robert Ferner and Albert Small also contributed their specialized skills to the collective effort. These men had already achieved significant success. They'd broken Japan's previous diplomatic cipher, a system Americans called red because they kept files on it in red folders. That earlier breakthrough had given American intelligence valuable access to Tokyo's communications for several years. Diplomatic negotiations, strategic assessments, reports from Japanese embassies worldwide, all had been readable thanks to the red break. But when Japan introduced purple in February 1939, everything changed. The new system was vastly more sophisticated than red. Techniques that had worked against the older cipher proved useless against its replacement. Purple was a wall nobody could scale. Genevieve was assigned to the team attacking purple. She began learning cryptanalysis fundamentals from Friedman himself, absorbing his methods, studying how cipher machines functioned, developing intuition for the subtle patterns that could reveal a system's secrets. It was intellectually demanding work, requiring both mathematical rigor and creative thinking. A codebreaker needed to be systematic enough to process thousands of messages without errors, yet imaginative enough to attempt approaches that had never been tried before. She discovered she loved it. This was the challenge she'd been seeking, something worthy of her abilities. For the first time since graduating from Buffalo, she felt her talents were being properly utilized. The problems she worked on were genuinely difficult. They required everything she had, and they mattered. The fate of nations might depend on breaking purple. The problem the team faced was formidable. They knew purple divided the alphabet into two groups, 6 letters enciphered by one mechanism and 20 letters enciphered by another. They'd figured out relatively quickly how the 6-letter group was scrambled. That part of the system resembled techniques they'd encountered before, but the 20-letter group remained completely impenetrable. No matter what approaches they tried, the larger group's encryption pattern refused to yield its secrets. The 20 letters seemed processed through something far more complex than anything they'd previously encountered. Month after month, the team worked without breakthrough. They analysed thousands of intercepted messages. They built statistical tables tracking letter frequencies and correlations. They tested theories about the machine's internal workings and watched them fail. Friedman drove himself relentlessly, and the strain began taking a terrible toll on his health. The pressure of knowing war was approaching, that lives might depend on breaking purple, that failure meant American forces would face the enemy blind, it wore him down physically and mentally. He worked 18-hour days. He barely slept. He obsessed over the problem even when supposedly resting. Eventually, the stress would send Friedman to a psychiatric hospital with a complete nervous breakdown. The man who had built American code breaking would be temporarily destroyed by the code he couldn't break. But before that collapse, there was still work to be done, and Genevieve Grotjan was doing it. By summer 1940, the situation had grown desperate. Europe was falling to Nazi Germany. France had surrendered in June, stunning the world. Britain stood alone against Hitler, its cities being bombed nightly during the Blitz. The Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact with Germany and was busy carving up Eastern Europe. Democracy itself seemed to be retreating everywhere. In the Pacific, Japan was growing more aggressive by the day. The Japanese had occupied French Indochina after France's defeat. They were clearly preparing for further expansion. American military leaders needed to know what Tokyo was planning. The purple cipher was their best hope of finding out. And it remained unbroken. Leo Rosen had suggested purple might use telephone stepping switches rather than Enigma-style rotating wheels. This insight had given the team a new direction to explore. Frank Rowlett had even built a crude device using stepping switches to test whether the theory might work. The results were promising but incomplete. They could explain some features of purple, but not the crucial 20-letter mechanism. Genevieve's approach to the problem was methodical and patient. She worked through intercepted messages systematically, building worksheets that tracked patterns in the cipher text. She searched for any hint of regularity, any clue that might reveal how the 20-letter group was being scrambled. She compared messages sent on the same day, which would have used identical machine settings. She looked for places where the partially decrypted 6-letter skeleton might provide clues about the 20-letter portion. It was tedious, exhausting work that offered no guarantee of success. She might spend weeks pursuing an approach that led nowhere. She might stare at worksheets for hours without seeing anything useful. Most people would have lost patience long before. But Genevieve had learned patience during her years at the Railroad Retirement Board. She knew how to keep working even when progress seemed impossible. September 20th, 1940 was a hot, humid day in Washington. The city sweltered under late summer heat. Fans ran in the munitions building offices, providing minimal relief. Genevieve sat at her desk, surrounded by worksheets covered in letters and numbers. She'd been working on this problem for months, just like everyone else on the team. There was no particular reason to expect this day would be different from any other. She was examining a set of partially reconstructed messages, looking at cipher text for the 20-letter group, comparing patterns across different messages encrypted with similar settings. The work required intense concentration. She had to hold multiple sequences in her mind simultaneously, searching for any correspondence that might reveal structure. And then she saw it. A sequence of letters that repeated, not randomly, but in a specific, predictable pattern. The repetition appeared in the same position across multiple messages. It couldn't be coincidental. Her heart must have quickened as she pulled out more worksheets, checking to see if the pattern held. It did. She found another example, then another. The repetition wasn't accidental. It was structural. It revealed something fundamental about how the machine worked. The 20 letters were being processed through interconnected stepping switches that moved in a specific, predictable cycle. And Genevieve had just discovered what that cycle looked like. Genevieve grabbed her papers and walked quickly to the next room where Frank Rowlett was reviewing work with Robert Ferner and Albert Small. She politely interrupted their discussion and asked if she could show them what she'd found. Years later, Rowlett would describe the moment in his memoirs. He wrote that they could see from her demeanour that she must have discovered something extraordinary. Genevieve led the men to her desk. She laid out her worksheets with careful precision. She pointed to a line on one sheet, then a line on another, then a third. She showed them the repeating pattern, explained how she'd found it, and demonstrated that it held across multiple messages. Then she stepped back and waited silently, her eyes focused behind her rimless glasses. For a long moment the room was still as the men studied what she'd shown them. They traced patterns with their fingers. They looked at each other. Then understanding dawned. What Genevieve had discovered was the key to unlocking the entire purple system. She'd found the pattern that revealed how the 20-letter group was being enciphered. The reaction was unlike anything normally seen in a military intelligence office. Albert Small began dashing around the room, hands clasped above his head like a victorious prizefighter. He yelled at the top of his voice. Robert Ferner, normally reserved and quiet, clapped his hands like an excited child and shouted with joy. Frank Rowlett jumped up and down, unable to contain himself. The room filled with shouts of celebration. People from other sections came running to see what had caused the commotion. William Friedman pushed his way into the crowded room. Rowlett pointed to Genevieve's worksheets. "Look what Miss Grotjan has just discovered," he said. Friedman studied the papers. He immediately understood their significance. The breakthrough they'd been seeking for 18 months had finally come. Genevieve's eyes filled with tears as the celebration swirled around her. She had done it. She had seen what no one else could see. To mark the moment, someone was sent out to buy Coca-Colas for everyone. It was a modest celebration for one of the most important achievements in American intelligence history. The team gathered together, raised their bottles, and toasted the young woman who had cracked purple. Within 1 week, on September 27th, Rowlett handed Friedman 2 complete deciphered purple messages. The cipher was broken. For the first time, America could read Japan's most secret diplomatic communications. How do you think Genevieve felt in that moment, knowing she'd solved a puzzle that had defeated everyone else? Share your thoughts below. The implications of Genevieve's discovery were enormous. Within weeks, Leo Rosen and the team used their new understanding of Purple's principles to build a working replica of the Japanese machine. They constructed it without ever having seen the original, using only their analysis of intercepted messages. No American had ever laid eyes on a real Purple machine. Yet based on Genevieve's breakthrough and subsequent analysis, they built a device that functioned identically. The machine cost about $685 in parts, mostly telephone stepping switches purchased from commercial suppliers. When the American replica was complete, it could encrypt and decrypt messages exactly as the Japanese original did. It was a triumph of reverse engineering that amazed everyone who understood what had been accomplished. With the replica machines operational, the Signal Intelligence Service could now decrypt Purple messages routinely. The intelligence they produced was given the codename Magic. Distribution was limited to a handful of the most senior officials in the American government. President Roosevelt received magic briefings. So did the Secretary of State and senior military leaders. It would become one of America's most valuable information sources throughout the coming war. The Japanese never knew Purple had been compromised. They continued trusting the system completely, sending their most sensitive communications through the cipher machine Genevieve Grotjan had cracked. They went to their graves, refusing to believe the code had been broken by analysis alone. Most assumed someone must have betrayed them, that a spy had stolen the secret. They couldn't accept that a young American mathematician had simply figured it out. The intelligence from Magic proved invaluable in the years ahead. When Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy on September 27, 1940, just 1 week after Genevieve's breakthrough, American analysts could read the diplomatic traffic surrounding the alliance. They gained insight into the tensions and calculations of the Axis powers. They learned what Japan had promised Hitler and what Germany had promised in return. As the war progressed, Magic would produce some of its most valuable intelligence through an unlikely source. General Hiroshi Oshima served as Japan's ambassador to Nazi Germany, and he had remarkably close access to Adolf Hitler and other senior German leaders. Oshima wasn't just a diplomat. He was a true believer in fascism who had cultivated personal relationships with Nazi leadership. Hitler liked him and spoke freely in his presence. Oshima would meet with Hitler for hours, and the German dictator would share detailed information about military plans, fortifications, and strategy. He discussed progress on the Eastern Front. He explained German defensive preparations in Western Europe, He revealed his thinking about future operations. These were some of the Third Reich's most closely guarded secrets, shared with a trusted ally. After these meetings, Oshima would compose lengthy reports and send them to Tokyo through the purple cipher. American codebreakers intercepted and decrypted these messages, gaining extraordinary insight into German military preparations. General George Marshall, the US Army Chief of Staff, would later describe Oshima's reports as America's main basis of information regarding Hitler's intentions in Europe. In 1944, Oshima toured the Atlantic Wall, fortifications Germany had constructed, along the coasts of France and Belgium to defend against Allied invasion. He inspected gun emplacements and bunker complexes. He spoke with German commanders about their defensive plans. He examined obstacles placed on beaches to stop landing craft. Then he sent detailed descriptions of everything he'd seen back to Tokyo. Those descriptions were read by American and British planners preparing for the D-Day invasion of Normandy. The intelligence helped the Allies understand what they would face when they crossed the English Channel. It revealed strengths and weaknesses in German defences. It contributed to planning that made June 6, 1944 a success, rather than a catastrophe. None of this would have been possible without Genevieve Grotjan's discovery on that September afternoon in 1940. A pattern she spotted in a worksheet translated into battlefield advantages that saved countless lives. The soldiers who waded ashore at Omaha Beach and Utah Beach benefited from intelligence that traced its origins to a young woman in Washington, who saw what others couldn't see. But even as her work was changing history's course, Genevieve remained unknown to the public. The secret of Purple's breaking was among the war's most closely guarded. Revealing that America could read Japanese diplomatic traffic would have prompted Tokyo to change its cipher system, cutting off the flow of invaluable intelligence. So Genevieve and her colleagues worked in complete anonymity, unable to tell anyone, even their families, what they were doing or why it mattered. The war brought tragedy even before America formally entered the conflict. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched its devastating surprise attack on the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Battleships burned. Thousands of sailors died. America was plunged into a war that would consume the next 4 years. The military disaster raised agonizing questions that would be debated for decades. America had been reading Japanese diplomatic traffic through magic. Why had the attack not been prevented? The answer was complicated and painful. Purple was a diplomatic cipher used by Japan's foreign ministry. The Imperial Japanese Navy used completely different encryption systems for its operational communications. The military planning for Pearl Harbor was never transmitted through Purple. The strike force maintained strict radio silence as it crossed the Pacific. The diplomatic messages that were intercepted gave indications that Japan was preparing for war and that negotiations might be broken off, but they didn't reveal the specific target or timing of the attack. Moreover, the volume of intercepted traffic was enormous, and the number of translators and analysts was small. Important messages sometimes sat in backlogs waiting to be processed. The distribution of magic intelligence was highly restricted, reaching only a handful of senior officials, some of whom didn't fully understand its significance or failed to connect different pieces of the puzzle. It was a failure of systems and communication, not of code breaking. The Pearl Harbor disaster only increased the urgency of signals intelligence work. The Signal Intelligence Service expanded rapidly, eventually moving to a larger facility at Arlington Hall, a former women's college in Virginia that had been requisitioned for the war effort. Thousands of new analysts were recruited, many of them women. By the war's end, approximately 7,000 of the 10,500 employees at Arlington Hall would be female. Genevieve continued her work, now more important than ever. In 1943, Genevieve married Hyman Feinstein, a chemist working on the Manhattan Project at the National Bureau of Standards. It was a wartime romance between two people, both engaged in the most secret work imaginable. Hyman was helping develop the atomic bomb that would end the war with Japan. Genevieve was reading Japanese diplomatic communications. Neither could discuss their activities with the other. Their marriage began with an unusual foundation of mutual mystery. Each knew the other was doing something important for the war effort. Each understood the requirements of secrecy that governed their professional lives, and each accepted that some questions couldn't be asked and some answers couldn't be given. They found common ground in their shared commitment to the war effort and their mutual respect for the sacrifices secrecy required. That same year, Genevieve was assigned to a new and equally challenging problem. American intelligence had begun intercepting encrypted communications between Soviet agents and Moscow. The Soviet Union was technically an ally, fighting alongside America against Germany, but even during the wartime alliance, some American officials worried about Soviet espionage. The intercepted Soviet messages suggested those worries were justified. The project to decrypt Soviet communications was given the code name Venona. It would continue for decades, from 1943 until 1980, eventually revealing extensive Soviet spy networks operating in the United States. And Genevieve Grotjan Feinstein would make another crucial contribution to its success. In November 1944, Genevieve made a discovery that the National Security Agency would later describe as the most important single cryptanalytic break in the whole history of Venona. She found a way to recognize when Soviet code clerks had improperly reused portions of their one-time pad encryption keys. This procedural error, which violated fundamental security practices, created a vulnerability that American analysts could exploit. A one-time pad, when used correctly, is theoretically unbreakable. The encryption key is a random sequence of numbers as long as the message itself. Each key is used only once, then destroyed. Because the key is truly random, there's no pattern for a codebreaker to find. Every possible decryption is equally likely, making the system immune to mathematical attack. But generating truly random keys is difficult, especially when producing them by the thousands. Soviet code clerks in the wartime chaos sometimes took shortcuts, reusing key material that should have been destroyed. They might use the same one-time pad pages for multiple messages, creating what cryptanalysts call depth. This was a serious security protocol violation, but it happened often enough to create opportunities. Genevieve developed a method for detecting these mistakes. By comparing intercepted messages, she could identify cases where the same key material had been used twice. Once such depth was identified, mathematical techniques could be applied to recover the underlying messages. Her discovery allowed American cryptanalysts to read communications that would otherwise have been completely secure. The Venona decrypts would eventually expose Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who passed atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. They would identify British intelligence officer Kim Philby as a Soviet agent. They would reveal the extent of Soviet penetration of the Manhattan Project and other sensitive American programs. The full impact of Genevieve's Venona breakthrough wouldn't be understood for decades, as the program remained classified until 1995. In 1946, as the war ended and America began transitioning to peacetime, Genevieve received the Exceptional Civilian Service Award from Brigadier General Paul Everton Peabody. It was one of the few official recognitions she would receive during her lifetime, and even it was granted without public acknowledgement of what she'd actually accomplished. The citation praised her contributions without specifying the nature of her work. The secret of purple remained closely guarded. Also in 1946, Genevieve and Hyman welcomed their son Ellis. It seemed her life was moving into a new chapter. She had achieved remarkable things during the war. Now perhaps she could enjoy a quieter existence as a wife and mother, leaving the world of secrets behind. In 1947, Genevieve resigned from government service. The reasons aren't entirely clear from the historical record. Perhaps she wanted to focus on raising her son. Perhaps the intense pressure of the wartime intelligence work had taken its toll on her health or spirit. Perhaps she simply felt her work was done, and it was time for a new generation to take over. Whatever her motivations, she stepped away from the world of code breaking she had helped transform. But she didn't abandon mathematics. Around 1957, she joined the faculty at George Mason University in Virginia, where her husband was a chemistry professor. She taught undergraduate mathematics, finally realizing her original dream of sharing her love of numbers with students. She was a quiet, unassuming professor. None of her students knew their teacher had changed the course of World War II. She didn't seek attention or recognition. She simply did her work, helping young people understand the beauty and power of mathematical thinking. Then tragedy struck in the cruelest possible way. In 1969, her son Ellis, who had followed his mother's path into mathematics and graduated from Swarthmore College with honours, died suddenly at age 22. He collapsed in the family's living room from a previously undiagnosed cardiac condition. Ellis had been awarded a National Science Foundation Fellowship for graduate study and was preparing for a brilliant academic career. He was planning to attend MIT. The future seemed unlimited, and then it was gone. One can only imagine Genevieve's heartbreak at losing her only child. Ellis had inherited her mathematical gifts. He had achieved academic honours just as she had. He had been poised to make his own mark on the world. And now he was gone, taken by a heart condition no one had known existed. The cruelty of it was almost unbearable. Joan Crawn, a neighbour who knew the family well, remembered Genevieve and Hyman as a quietly intellectual couple who kept their grief private. They didn't make public displays of their sorrow. They didn't seek sympathy from others. Somehow they continued attending to the ordinary activities of life from their home in Fairfax, Virginia. They had dinner with friends. They maintained their garden. They went through the motions of living, even when living must have seemed impossibly painful. Hyman Feinstein died in 1995. Before his death, he established the Genevieve Feinstein Award in Cryptography at George Mason University, a prize given annually to an outstanding undergraduate mathematics student. It was his way of honouring his wife's achievements, even though the full scope of those achievements remained classified and unknown to the public. The award continues to be given to this day, a small monument to a woman whose contributions changed history. Genevieve Grotjan Feinstein died on August 10, 2006, at age 93. She had outlived her husband, her son, and most of the colleagues who had worked alongside her during the war. She died without a single living descendant to carry on her name or her memory. The tragedy of losing Ellis meant that her direct line ended with her. For most of her life, the true story of what Genevieve had accomplished remained classified. The breaking of purple wasn't publicly acknowledged until the 1970s, and even then the details emerged slowly. The Venona project wasn't declassified until 1995, nearly 50 years after the war ended. By the time the historical record began to fully emerge, Genevieve was elderly and largely unknown. She gave few interviews about her wartime work. When historian David Kahn spoke with her in 1991, she was characteristically modest about her role in the purple breakthrough. "Maybe I was just lucky," she said. "I was excited and interested and looking forward to working on the mechanism. I regarded it more as just one step in a series of steps." But others understood the magnitude of what she'd done. The Encyclopedia of American Women at War called her breakthrough on purple one of the greatest achievements in the history of American code breaking. Military historians recognize that the intelligence produced by magic had shortened the war and saved countless lives. In 2010, 4 years after her death, the National Security Agency announced that Genevieve Grotjan Feinstein would be inducted into the National Cryptologic Museum Hall of Honor. The ceremony took place on April 6, 2011, recognizing her as a brilliant cryptanalyst whose findings led to breaking the Japanese code purple in time for World War II. Sadly, because Genevieve had no living relatives, the NSA couldn't locate a family member to attend the ceremony. They ended up inviting a member of the George Mason University Mathematics Department to accept the honor on her behalf. The woman who had helped save thousands of lives received her highest recognition with no family there to witness it. It was a bittersweet moment, honoring extraordinary achievement while highlighting the personal losses that had marked her later years. In 2018, the University at Buffalo Alumni magazine finally gave Genevieve the public recognition she deserved, featuring her story under the headline, "An American Hero." The article traced her journey from summa cum laude graduate unable to find a teaching job to one of the most important codebreakers in American history. Her alma mater acknowledged what the nation had largely forgotten. The legacy of Genevieve Grotjan Feinstein extends far beyond the specific codes she helped break. Her story demonstrates that genius can emerge from anywhere, that the person who solves an impossible problem might be a railroad clerk rather than a credentialed expert. It shows the importance of looking for talent in unexpected places and giving opportunity to those who might otherwise be overlooked. William Friedman understood this. He recruited mathematicians and linguists, musicians and crossword enthusiasts. He built teams of people who thought differently from one another, and when a young woman with no code-breaking experience spotted a pattern that had eluded everyone else, he celebrated her achievement rather than resenting that a junior analyst had succeeded where senior cryptanalysts had failed. That culture of intellectual humility was essential to the success of American code-breaking. The contributions of women to American intelligence during World War II have only recently begun to receive proper recognition. More than 10,000 women served as codebreakers for the Army and Navy. They worked around the clock in windowless buildings, processing the endless stream of intercepted messages. They solved codes, translated documents, and provided intelligence that shaped military operations across the globe. Without them, the war would have lasted longer and cost more lives. After the war ended, most of these women went home without recognition. They had been sworn to secrecy, and they kept their oaths for decades. Many never told their own children what they'd done during the war. When asked, they said they'd been clerks or typists. Historian Liza Mundy, who wrote the book Code Girls about these women, noted that they came from a generation when women didn't expect or receive credit for achievement in public life. They did their duty and then disappeared into private life. Genevieve Grotjan Feinstein was part of that generation. She did extraordinary work without expectation of recognition. She kept secrets for a lifetime. She never sought fame or public acknowledgement. And when recognition finally came, it came too late for her to appreciate it. But history has its own timeline, and eventually truth emerges. The full story of Purple and Magic and Venona is now part of the public record. Genevieve's name is inscribed in the Hall of Honor at the National Cryptologic Museum, alongside the greatest figures in the history of American signals intelligence. Scholars can study her achievement and recognize its significance. Future generations can learn from her example. And perhaps most fitting of all, there's still a prize given each year in her name at George Mason University, rewarding mathematical excellence in young students who might someday accomplish something unexpected and extraordinary. The railroad clerk who became a codebreaker would surely appreciate that her legacy lives on in the recognition of mathematical talent in others. The Signal Intelligence Service that Genevieve joined in 1939 would eventually evolve into the National Security Agency, one of the largest and most sophisticated intelligence organizations in the world. The techniques pioneered by Friedman, Rowlett, and their colleagues became the foundation of modern signals intelligence. The mathematical approaches they developed are still studied today, and the organizational culture they created, one that valued intellectual achievement over formal credentials, continues to shape how intelligence agencies recruit and develop talent. Genevieve's story also illustrates the hidden contributions of women to the Allied victory in World War II. The war effort depended on women in ways that have only recently been fully acknowledged. They worked in factories building planes and tanks. They served as nurses on the front lines. And in places like Arlington Hall, they broke codes that changed the course of battles. The secrecy that surrounded their work meant their contributions went unrecognized for decades. They couldn't explain to their families what they'd done. They couldn't put their wartime service on a resume. They returned to civilian life and were expected to resume traditional roles as wives and mothers. Many of them did exactly that, raising families and pursuing careers that had nothing to do with intelligence work. But they carried their secrets with them, knowing they'd been part of something extraordinary, even if the world would never know. Genevieve was different from most of her fellow code girls in one important respect. She made not one, but two major cryptanalytic breakthroughs, first against Purple, then against the Soviet one-time pad system. Very few cryptanalysts in history have achieved such success against multiple major targets. Her combination of mathematical ability, patience, and insight placed her among the elite practitioners of her profession. The lessons of Genevieve's life resonate beyond the world of intelligence and code-breaking. She faced rejection and disappointment early in her career. She couldn't find work in the field she'd trained for. She took a job that seemed far beneath her abilities. But she never stopped developing her skills. She never stopped believing that her moment would come. When opportunity finally arrived in the form of William Friedman's job offer, she was ready. The pattern she spotted on September 20th, 1940 wasn't luck. It was the result of months of patient, systematic work. It was the product of a mind that had been honed by years of mathematical study and practice. She succeeded because she had prepared herself to succeed, even when success seemed unlikely. In our own time, when algorithms and artificial intelligence dominate discussions of cryptography, it's worth remembering that the most important breakthroughs still come from human insight. Genevieve didn't have computers to help her analyze purple. She had worksheets and pencils and her own extraordinary mind. She solved one of the most complex cryptographic challenges of her era through pure mathematical reasoning. The railroad clerk who cracked the hardest code didn't do it through technology or resources that others lacked. She did it through patience, persistence, and the ability to see what others couldn't see. She proved that a single person with the right skills and determination could change the course of history. Genevieve Grotjan Feinstein never sought fame or recognition. She never wrote memoirs about her achievements. She never gave speeches about her role in winning the war. She lived quietly, taught mathematics, mourned her losses, and eventually passed from this world with no living family to remember her. But the intelligence she helped produce saved countless lives and shortened a global war. The soldiers who came home because Allied commanders had better intelligence. The sailors who survived because the enemy's plans were known in advance. The families that remained intact because one woman saw a pattern in the chaos. That is her true legacy. Be patient. Be persistent. Trust your abilities even when others overlook them. Keep working even when the problem seems impossible. That was the lesson of Genevieve Grotjan. That was the lesson of the railroad clerk. That was the lesson of the woman who cracked the code called purple. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people who care about the heroes who got forgotten. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing these stories from dusty archives and obscurity every single week. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching.